Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to learn all about selectors in CSS. We've seen a little bit on element selectors in previous videos, though we haven't spent a huge amount of time discussing selectors in detail specifically. There are several different types of selectors that allow us to assign styles to specific elements within our HTML documents. We can select an element like an H1 or a div or a button and then apply some style to it with CSS. So for example, we can target all H2 elements on the page and say that we wanted those to be the color red. And in this video, we'll look at exactly how we do this and more. We're going to focus on three types of selectors in this video to get us up and running. And these are element selectors, ID selectors, and class selectors. In the next video, we'll build on this and have a look at some more advanced selectors, including attribute selectors, descendant selectors, and more. And we'll look at how we can combine these with those that we learn in this video to be even more specific and accurate with what we are targeting. So let's revisit our general rule again. We have a selector here and a declaration block. A declaration is comprised of a property and a value separated by a colon. We end each declaration with a semicolon. We can then add another style declaration after this if we so choose to. We can have multiple style declarations within a selector's declaration block. So we could target an H2 and one declaration could be color :red. Then a second might be font weight :300. A third might be text transform uppercase, and so on. We can have as many style declarations of property and value as we like within a declaration block, thousands if you so wish. But rather than talking about it, let's get our hands dirty and write some CSS selectors of our own. We'll start off by looking at the element selector first, and after that we'll look at class and ID selectors. I have a simple project open here in VS Code, and you can find the link to the starting and end code in the description below. It's currently just a simple HTML file that has a linked style sheet where we're going to write our styles. You can either download it from GitHub using this green download button, and then you would simply open it in your favorite text editor, and that's VS Code in my case. Alternatively, you might not be able to download the project if you're working on a public computer, for example, so there are CodePen links to the starting and ending files as well. You don't need an account at CodePen, and you can start coding away immediately. From VS Code, I have the project open in the browser already using the live server extension, and using this means any changes that I make are reflected straight away in the browser. You can add this extension to VS Code via the Extensions tab here on the left, search for Live Server and install. To open the file with Live Server, you just right click and open with Live Server. Then you're ready to go. No need to do this with CodePen, as CodePen is set up to automatically reload any changes. So in the style sheet, I've added the general rule at the top to guide me. My index.html file is now waiting for some CSS, and it's in its unstyled state currently. We've just got a very simple and unrealistic HTML structure with a few elements to play with, and you see the output in the browser. There's nothing fancy here, but it suits our purposes for this video. So let's remind ourselves about the three kinds of basic selectors that we'll be focusing on in this video. We're going to be working with element selectors, class selectors, and ID selectors. And I've already added comments where we will write each of these. We'll start with the element or type selector, as it is also known, and we use this to select and assign styles directly to HTML elements. Adding an H2 element selector would apply any styles contained in that selector's declaration block to all of the H2 elements on our page. So in our style sheet, I'm going to select the H2 elements and then make them orange. I'll follow the rule I've added at the top of the style sheet, so we add what we're selecting, in this case the H2, and then we have a set of curly braces that marks our declaration block. We'll create some room inside by hitting enter, and then we need a style declaration, which we know is made of a property and its value separated by a colon. We want to turn the H2s to the color orange, so the property is simply color and the value is orange. We then have a semicolon to end the declaration. And it's that simple. So if we save now, Then Live Server or CodePen will get to work and we see our changes displayed in the browser. Notice that we've added one simple style and it's styled both of the H2s on our page. If we add 100 or 1000 H2 elements, then they would all be orange right now. Maybe we want to change the background color of the H2s to black. Our declaration block, as we said earlier, can contain more than one style declaration, and there can be hundreds or thousands if we so wish. So back in our H2 element selector, we'll add a second style declaration of background dash color and the value of black. And you'll see now that when we save, we have those two styles applied to both of our H2s. If we inspect the page using DevTools, we have a body element here and a root or top level HTML element, and we can of course target these if we wanted to, as any HTML element can be targeted using CSS selectors. So as everything on the page is nested inside the body element, any styles that we add to the body element will affect the whole page, as styles are inherited by child elements. We'll talk more about this concept of inheritance in a later video, and when that's done I'll add the link on page right now. So if you're not seeing that link, then it isn't made yet, and I will also put the link down below in the description in due course when the video is ready. Okay, so let's say I wanted to change this default Times New Roman font that the browser gives us. I could select the body element and assign a new fonts family to it. So in our CSS file, we'll use a body element selector, then our curly braces for the declaration block. Then we can just type FF, as if you're in VS Code, you can make use of the Emmet shortcut for the font family property, which is FF. If we choose font family from the list, then we are given this huge list of font stacks. We'll select this one, as it's one that I haven't used before, and we see we have this comma separated list of fonts. The shortcut that I just used isn't going to work in the same way on CodePen, unfortunately, so I will add the font stack below in the description for you to paste in now. You can still go and type in FF and hit tab, and it will give you the font family property, but if you want to use this same font stack that I'm using, pause the video now quickly, grab it from below and paste it in to CodePen. Okay, so a font stack gives us a stack of fonts that act as fallback options. The browser reads the font stack and will always try to display text in the font that is in the first position in the stack. And if it cannot, for whatever reason, display text in that given font, it will fall back to the next option in the list. If it can't display text in that particular font, it will fall back to the third option, and so on. You can have as many listed here as you like, or just one font like sans serif, which is going to be recognized everywhere in all browsers. So if we save now, we see the font change to that sans serif. I'll bring back in the other fonts that I deleted a second ago, and we'll save again, and we see the font update once more. If I go through and misspell each font, making them unrecognizable to the browser, we see that it will fall back and display in the sans serif. I'll correct the spelling, bring each font back in one by one, and we see that when we get to Sego UI, there's no change. So Chrome hasn't been able to display the text in that font, which I believe is a Microsoft system font, so it's fallen back to the next font in the stack, which is Tahoma. We can add some more fonts related properties. So we'll have italic font style, a font weight of bold, a font size of 90%, and we'll just put the font family back for now to a standard sans serif font. So here we have a series of properties all related to how our text is going to display. We have slightly smaller italic sans serif text in bold. In all cases we've seen so far, with the exception of the font stack, a CSS properties value has been a single keyword, so color orange, font style italic, and so on. But CSS properties can also have a space separated list of keywords. Now, not every CSS property can access multiple keywords though, but many can. Also, many properties, like all of these font related properties, can be collected in one shorthand property. So instead of these 4 individual properties of font style, font weight, font size and font family, we can use the shorthand font property and add all of the values to it separated by spaces. So we'll say font, italic, bold, 90%, sans serif. Now we'll comment out the individual properties that we had and we'll save, and the styles are unchanged. Note the spaces between each keyword. The space allows the browser to distinguish between the keywords and apply them correctly. The space separated words are referred to as keywords because taken together they actually form the value of the property in question. So each of these is no longer a series of values but a series of keywords that together form the value of the shorthand fonts property. The order that we add the keywords is important, so if I move the italic keyword to the end, we see that the font styles will now fail to load at all. You can find out more about the shorthand font property here at MDN and more about other shorthand properties that you can use here at this link. Common ones that you'll use will be for margins and paddings, for example, so I encourage you to have a look through this and have a go at experimenting with applying the longhand and shorthand properties. The main takeaway here is that you know that they exist for given related CSS properties and that they are a property and an ordered space-separated list of keywords that comprise the property's value. Okay, so at the moment our H2s have orange text on a black background, but what if we wanted the H1 we have at the top of the page to adopt these same styles? If we inspect the H1 in the browser, we can see the styles applied to it currently. We have styles coming from the user agent style sheet applied straight to the H1, and also inherited from the HTML elements. So the user agent style sheet styles are those applied by the browser by default. We spoke in the last video about default styles and how we can reset those, so the link to that is on screen now if you haven't seen it. We mentioned that styles can be inherited a few minutes ago by child components, and we know the H1 is a child of the HTML element, so it's inheriting its black color text from the style applied to the HTML element by the browser. We also see that the H1 is inheriting the font from the body element, and we can toggle that on and off in DevTools by checking and unchecking this box. We also see the styles are coming this time not from the browser but from our own style.css file, and this number at the end here is the line that the style rule is applied at. If we click that, it will open the file up for us in the sources tab, and we have our whole CSS file, and we see it matches exactly what we have in the text editor over here. So if I wanted the H1 to have the same styles as the H2, we could say H1, then our curly braces for the declaration block, and we will copy the styles in the H2 selector and paste these in. We save and the styles are applied. But you might notice that this is actually repetitive. We're repeating the styles that we've already declared. We want to keep our code as clean as possible, so we want to adhere to the dry principle of don't repeat yourself where possible. So instead of repeating ourselves in this way, we can group selectors that will share styles. So I'll delete those H1 styles and save, and instead we can say H1, comma, H2, and our H1 has its styles back once we save. Here we're grouping selectors separated by commas to apply the same styles to multiple elements at once. We can have as many elements grouped as we like into a group selector. There's no limit. We just need to make sure that we separate them with commas. So I'll add the H3 to our group as well, and I'll change the color to spring green. And when we save, you see that we have those styles now applied to all of our headings. Okay, cool. So I think that's as far as we're going to go with element selectors for now. We know that we select the elements by name. This could be an H1 or a paragraph element or a div, a UL, a nav element, the body element, whatever element we like, and then we apply styles to the element in our declaration block. We saw that we can also group selectors that share styles, say all of the headings on the page like we just demonstrated. We can also apply styles without worrying about the given elements or elements involved by using class selectors or ID selectors. These allow us to assign styles independent of the element type, and like we saw with element selectors, they can be used on their own or grouped with other classes, IDs or element selectors. Before we can use ID or class selectors, we need to modify the HTML markup by adding classes and ID attributes to the opening tags of elements. We'll start with IDs, and an ID is a unique identifier which can be used just once per page. You can have many different IDs for our page, of course, but each particular individual ID can be used just once. So, for example, if I had an ID called header, I could use that header ID once. If I had an ID called container, I could only use that ID once on the page. I do have a video on classes and IDs which is popping up on screen now, so if you want to learn more about the usage of IDs, then that's the video for you. At the moment, both of our H2 elements are styled exactly the same. Maybe we don't want that. Maybe we want one styled one way and the other H2 styled differently. To do that, we need a way to be able to select just one of the H2s and give it some styles that don't apply to the other H2s on the page. One way to select just one of them individually could be with an ID. So I'll go back to the HTML, and inside the opening tags of the first H2, I'm going to add an ID attribute. And I'll give this the value of first-H2 and save. There's no change at the moment, of course, as we aren't yet assigning any CSS to the element that has that ID. In CSS, we write ID selectors in almost the same way as we would an element selector, but with a slight difference. So our ID was called first-H2. I'll write that in, and then I will add the curly braces, and I'll give this the color of magenta. So before I save this, what do you think is going to happen? Well, let's try it out. Let's give it a go and see what happens. So I save and nothing happens. We definitely have our ID added in the HTML, and we've selected it in the CSS, or have we? When we hover over the selector, we see that it actually thinks we're trying to select an HTML element called first-H2, which doesn't exist, of course. For elements, we select them simply by referencing them by name, as we've seen, H1 or P or div or H2, etc. And for IDs, we also reference them by name, first-H2 in our case, but there is a slight difference in that we need to add a hash or octothorpe symbol preceding the name of the ID. So in our case here, we would say hash first-H2. And now when we save, we do see the change. So it's a small syntactical change. Elements we reference by name, IDs we reference by name of the ID preceded by a hash or octothorpe. Next, I'll go back to the H2 and I'll add an ID to the second paragraph. So I'll go to the HTML and say ID is second-paragraph. Then I'll copy that, paste it into the style sheet with a hash in front, and I'll add our declaration block. And we'll say color again is magenta. And when I save, we have a magenta second paragraph, while the first one is totally unaffected. So using the ID selector will style the element that has the specified ID only. We can use any styles we want in here, and they will all be applied to the element with that given ID. As what we did just then was repetitive, we might want to group these IDs. So again, I can copy the ID name and delete this whole selector, and we'll group it with the first H2 ID as the styles are shared. We'll save again, and there we go. Grouped IDs and the styles are still there on the page. You commonly see a container or wrapper ID on the outer div that will wrap all of the elements on the page. You'd only have one outer wrapper, so an ID is a really good option. Looking at our HTML, we have this div, and inside this we are nesting all of the other elements on the page. We'll give this an ID of wrapper, and in our style sheet we'll go ahead and we'll add the matching selector. Now we can use this to create broad rules for all of the elements on the page, like aligning things and setting margin and padding, for example. So in here we could add, say, a margin of 40 pixels. We could align all of the text centrally, and I'll also give it a background color of, let's say, deep sky blue. We could also add things like padding or define this containing element as a flex container for use with Flexbox, but we'll leave it here for now. So an ID is used to identify one element uniquely, and it can only be used one time per page, as we've already established. This ID can be given to a div, a paragraph, or whatever HTML element you like. We can also use IDs for purposes of internal linking on our pages, which is really cool. And also when using forms, we can use IDs to bind labels to form inputs. So the uses of IDs really do stretch beyond targeting individual elements for styling with CSS. IDs are limited in being able to target just one element, and to select multiple elements of varying kinds, we would typically use a class selector. Class selectors are written with a period or a full stop, followed by the name of the class. That class name is given by the value of a class attribute applied to an HTML element. So the CSS syntax for classes is almost the same as we've already seen. For elements, we reference the element's name. For IDs, we reference the ID name preceded by a hash or octothorpe. For classes, we reference the name of the class preceded by a period or full stop. So it's fairly simple stuff. So here we have these grouped IDs that both have the color magenta applied. This is a poor use of IDs, and we would be better served here by just using a class to apply that color to whichever elements need it. So I will copy and then comment out the grouped ID selectors here and save, and those styles disappear. I'll paste in what I copied under my comment here for class selectors, and replace the ID selectors with a class of magenta dash text. And do remember to add the period or full stop before the name of the class. Now in the HTML file, I'll create a multiple selection, and the next step would be to add a class attribute. The name of the class was magenta dash text, and if we save, the selector can target any elements with a matching class, and those styles are applied, this time in a much better way. I'll also underline the magenta text using a text decoration of underline. I'll give the elements with this class some padding as well of 20 pixels. And we'll also give it a border of 3 pixels, solid, and magenta. We save, and there you go. We can quite clearly see which elements have that class applied. One style rule using a class selector, and it gives all of those styles to all elements that have that class attribute, whatever type of element they may be. In our case, the class is on an H2 and a paragraph element. The second paragraph is now styled quite differently to the first, and our first H2 is styled quite differently to the other H2 element on the page. Let's keep going and add some more classes. So in the style sheet, I'm going to add another class called dot dashed dash border, and I'll give this the style declaration of border, 3 pixels, dashed, and black. Now when I go to my HTML, any element that I add this to will have a dashed black border applied. We'll start with the wrapper div and add our class attribute, and we want the class of dashed border. We save, and we see that that is applied. We'll copy that and go up a level and give it also to the body element. If we save again, we see that the wrapper has the dashed border, and now so does the body. We can even go up one more level and give this class to the HTML element, and if we save, we can see that we now have a dashed border outside the border that is on the body element. We can keep adding the same class over and over again to whatever element we like, and if we make any changes to the styles of a given selector, all elements that are affected will adopt those changes. We even now have elements that have both an ID and a class, and we simply separate these in the HTML element using a space. In CodePen, you may have noticed that you don't have a body or an HTML opening tag available for you to add class attributes to, as you're only given this panel to work in. You have a couple of options. You can add it to the body and HTML elements in DevTools, which will not be a permanent save, or you could add a body element around what is already there in the panel currently and add the class to that. Then you could go to Settings, HTML, and here we can add classes to the HTML element. So you put dashed border here, or in the CSS you could add a grouped selector of HTML, body, dot dashed border, which is probably in this case the simplest fix here. We can also have multiple classes applied to one element. We aren't limited to just one. We know that a single class can be applied to many elements of different kinds, and also a single element, say an H2, can have more than one class. To show you, I'm going to go to the second P element and I'm going to add 2 more classes to it. We don't need to come out here and add a fresh class attribute again. We just have the one class attribute declared, and each class we add goes inside the double quotes and is separated by a space. So I'm going to add 2 classes to this P element called uppercase and another called big dash text, remembering to add spaces to separate each class name. If I save that, we see no difference on the page, of course, and that's because we need to select these with our CSS and define the styles that are going to be associated with them. So let's head over there and I'll add 2 new selectors, one called uppercase and another called big text, and again remembering of course to include the period before the class name so that our CSS knows that we're looking to select a class. I'm going to give both of these font and text related properties, which we'll see in detail in a later video on text and fonts in CSS. So uppercase will have a text transform property with the value of uppercase, and big text will have a font size property which we saw earlier and the value of 150%. Let's hit save, and in addition to the styles that are currently applied to this second paragraph, we should see new styles from our 2 new classes that increase the font size and make all letters uppercase. 3 classes and 1 ID selector, all providing styles to one single element. At this point, it's important to also add that this space separated list of classes, ID selectors can't actually be combined in this way. IDs do not permit a space separated list of words, so I'm going to create 2 IDs now, one called yellow, which is going to apply the color of yellow, and another ID called small dash text, and this is going to have a font size property that makes the text 50% of its size. We see that when I go to the H3 at the bottom, I can give it the ID of yellow and then save, and as expected we should see our yellow text. I can also give it the ID of small text, and again we save, and there we have our small text. But if we want both together, it short circuits and nothing is applied. So another plus of using classes, you can combine them on elements via space separated lists, and this is something that you cannot do with IDs. Also, we can group classes with other selectors like we saw earlier when we grouped elements. So we could say all P elements now, and all elements with the dots uppercase class, and all elements that have the yellow ID. Okay, so before our page gets any uglier, we'll summarise what we've seen in this video. In our style sheet, we reference the name of the ID preceded by a hash or octothorpe, and we reference a class by using a full stop preceding the name of the class. These will select elements that have matching IDs or classes added to their opening tags as attributes. When simply selecting an HTML element, you just need to reference the element by its name, and you don't need to add anything additional to the HTML. A class name can be used as many times on a page as we like, as opposed to an ID, which we use just once to uniquely identify an element, say for example a wrapper or a navbar or a footer, which will only appear once on any web page. We can group elements and classes and IDs into one selector, and our declaration blocks, the bits between the curly braces, can contain as many or as few style declarations as we like. Most CSS properties will have one-word values associated with them, and others will have several space-separated keywords that comprise the property's value. Okay, so we'll stop here. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please remember to like, subscribe, share, and all of that good stuff, and reach out to us on social media or in the comments below if you have any questions. Links to all of the resources used in this video are in the description, and if you want to read more about selectors, I've added some links to resources on MDN and CSS tricks. Other than that, just practice making some simple HTML pages and mess around with selecting elements and applying some styles. Looks aren't really important at this stage. All of that will come with time later on. So join me in the next video, which is going to carry on with CSS selectors, and we'll look at some advanced selectors to help us more accurately burrow down and target specific elements. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.